Good evening and welcome to iNN's Headlines and Beyond for April 3rd, 2012. And we're going to begin to change up our format once again. Uh, it's a small tweak, but not much, but nonetheless a tweak. We were have had initially we just sort of talking about the headlines in different forms. Then we moved to domestic affairs and foreign affairs. And now what we're doing is we're moving economic issues off this channel onto a new channel that's going to be called DECB Economics TV. That channel is going to be specifically for economics, where we will talk about economics issue in detail and really get into a lot of the mechanics behind the economy so that you can understand economic issues a lot better. This channel, although it's going to look at a lot of the technical issues of the economy and be good enough for bankers and so on and so forth to follow. The whole purpose of DECB Economics TV is to bring to the average public, to the average viewer, the information that a lot of bankers would understand. So it's not a textbook academic economic study. This is real world banking economics that will be on the DECB Economic TV, that new channel that's on YouTube. There is going to be a link in the down below bar so that you can go ahead and follow that. What we are going to do now is we're going to shift or look a little bit in domestic policy now, because we're taking out the economic issues and looking at sort of the science of politics, which would include behavior analysis. So we're going to take a more structured look at what's going on behind the news, what are some of the causes behind the news, and we're going to start taking, you'll see, a look at what different media outlets are reporting and how they're reporting it. Then as we start looking behind the headlines, we're going to start trying to dissect what's being said, what's being parsed out, people's different views on these different things, and that way you can sort of get an idea of what's going on out in the world. So we're now taking our next step into real world politics, our next step into the geopolitical sphere. And tonight, after this show, there'll be a link in the download bar. Instead of being episode 3 for now you're going to surprise, it'll be episode 4, because I'll be uploading that in just in a little while. So that being said, let's get on to our headlines. The whole headline that really sort of popped up today was in domestic affairs was, of course, the Republican primary. There was another whole set of primaries held today, and once that happens, what you get is you get people following, particularly the major news channels, following the election, and they'll post these so-called election results. What you need to understand is a lot of time the election results aren't real election results. They're basically, sometimes they're based on something known as these exit polls. Basically, as people are coming out of the polls, they'll stop and talk to people, and they'll poll them. It's basically like it's sort of like the questionnaires or the polls that they do over the phone. The problem with that is that many people may not feel comfortable telling you how they voted. So they will either tell you what they think they want you to hear, or they won't comment on it, or maybe there'll be even people there who will tell you, something else. So exit polls have become notorious for being inaccurate, and same with the polls as they get the sort of the demographic polls. How many Hispanic women had voted, how many women had voted. All these polls are basically statistically generated. They're all done by computer, and you can, depending on how you use the formula you use, the statistics you use, you can skew the numbers in almost any direction that you want it to go in, and you can skew a poll in almost any direction you want it to go in as well. Including how you describe the poll to the people on the air. And so the polling is no longer a litmus test to determine whether or not somebody's telling the truth or who has the better idea or not, because these things can be, the polls can be and have been skewed in the past, and they've shown that you can create false polling results. But that doesn't deter a lot of the pundits out there. And now they're talking about that Romney has more or less clinched the nomination, and they're talking about that Romney is, so far ahead. And they go up there and they try to do all these maps, and they have these amazing graphics that they have out there now. Now that they're using the computers and everything, they're using these touch sensitive monitors. And they can sort of fly things around and recalculate this, and they're giving all these sort of what-if scenarios. But the problem is that a large chunk of this is simply because they've really got nothing to say. They're not talking about any of the substances, the substantive issues that are that are behind the situations. Like, they could be talking about some of these. And they do touch on them, but again, you get lines flying back and forth between both sides. And not all these lines on both sides are actually that accurate. This is about, they have now, where Obama put in that women can now receive contraceptives in their health care package as part of their insurance. And you have one side saying that this is a violation of a religious organization's belief, and it is. If a Roman Catholic has these organizations where they employ people, they're now forced to supply birth control, even though it's a violation of their beliefs, to their employees. But the problem is that, and this is what they haven't actually called, Republicans haven't called the Obama's administration on the left on this. The social left seems to think that all these entitlements will come out of thin air. They don't really seem to understand and see what's happening in Europe and see that, hey, there's a problem, we have to pay for everything. So right now, with Obama in charge, the left is still trumpeting their social economic causes and saying we should be heading in the direction of Europe. Where if you simply look at China and India, who are coming away from the social economic system, because they were communists, they were very socialist in the past, and adopted the Reagan economic policies, you can see a vast distinction between the two different directions. Yet this dynamic is never mentioned by the Republicans. Of course, it's never mentioned by the Democrats. It's not mentioned by the Democrats that you have a lot of these medical associations and all these different organizations who collect monies and charities, that they could have stepped up and done something, but they haven't done anything. Because in the United States, if you have a private healthcare system, there's no reason why any of these charities couldn't have stepped in and created their own social healthcare system. It wasn't that the government had to step in and do this. This is something in terms of socialism that could have been done on their own, because the system permitted it. It's only when you get into the philosophy of socialism that everything has to be done by the government, and these people do absolutely nothing except for the comment about it, that you begin to realize that these people aren't going to, even though they have the capacity to do something, they're not going to, because their views is the government should be doing this. That this is something that is a governmental thing. And of course, they set themselves above society as the great thinkers, the great intellectuals, And they call anyone who disagrees with them flat earthers, rural country bumpkins, morons, idiots, um, knuckle draggers. Basically, they start belittling anyone who doesn't have their intellectual thought, this Western intellectual thought. They start belittling them because they don't think the way that they do. And this is, if you look at Western intellectual thought compared to human history, and in particular to Eastern thought, which is significantly different than Western thought, even though Western thought does borrow to a certain degree from Eastern thought. Western thought, does have Western and Eastern thought are two really distinct things, and so are the cultures. Now, the Eastern thought, the Eastern ideas, are significantly older than the Western ideas are, than the Western thought is. The Western concepts of gender and family dynamics that are now being played out in the school systems by the various different psychologists, really, the earliest you can go back is basically about 1900, but they really weren't in the schools until 1990. The curriculum that was heavily influenced by modern psychology and the socialist kind of modern theology, psychology, didn't really come into the schools till 1985, 1990, when they started changing the books, and when you had a more politically correct mindset coming in, and they began censoring a lot of books for a lot of these views and things they thought were sexist and would be bad influence on the children who were in school. And so they began changing a lot of the textbooks. They began making these curriculums to be compatible with the modern psychological thought, or the modern. Modern psychological thought is the basis for which all of Western thought now sort of revolves around. And it's got a whole history in here. There's a whole history behind Western philosophy where you can sort of see it feeding in. But the history of Western philosophy is not a good one. The history of Western philosophy includes Stalinism, includes Nazism, it includes numbers of massacres and millions of dead. In the same aspect that they can sort of go back and say, well, we aren't religion, because religion creates all these horrors. Well, unfortunately, if you look at history, socialism has done the exact same thing. Like this whole idea of a concept world or a socialist utopia is something that has been tried before. This is not something new. What you're seeing now, and we're seeing in this environment, particularly with the Democratic left with Obama, is a regeneration of socialism, ignoring the past, being fully ignorant of the past, and saying things are different this time. But if you look at what's actually going on beyond the sort of the theory, beyond the concept, and look at the reality of what's going on, you can see that this isn't true. You see that a lot of times the views that are being presented by the left and the concepts are only valid and defended by the assertion of the person providing the argument. So Obama is known and is very popular to be as an intellectual. He's considered to be very intelligent, very well-spoken, and this is the authority by which he is trusted. So anything that he says, because he's an intellectual, because he is held in such high regard by the socialists, must be true. And this is the fundamentals of the argument there on the left side. And it's as sort of blindly trusting as they would call the religious right who simply parrot what a pastor says. Now, if you actually go into the history of on the right, to see where the right has come out of, the Christian right, you'll find that they too have a very short history. The evangelical movement does not have a long history. Christianity is 2,000 years old, and the evangelical movement is at most maybe 200 years old. So around 1800 in the United States, you really had a strong evangelical movement going across the United States, and and this is where what led to later on in the prohibition in the 1930s. You had a strong sort of evangelical, or what we call a revivalist movement, and this is why a lot of rural people sort of have this sort of this environmental this sort of not environment the evangelical view. But the thing is, and this is what I had mentioned before, that when it comes to this whole argument of intellectualism versus the rural belief in the Bible or God and guns, the irony comes in is that the intellectuals who argue that they are superior and use Darwin to point out this superiority have no concept of where the food comes from. Yet the country bumpkin, the idiot, as they call them, as the left calls them, does. And they directly see where their food comes from. And this has been shown in Greece, and if anyone who's watched sort of the events unfold in Greece, this is something that is not new. This has happened once before after the civil wars and the different events that sort of shaped Greece to the way it is today, where you had after the wars the food supply cut off in Greece to the cities. So people in the cities that we have now, we have homelessness, you have people starving in the street, you have an enormous amount of poverty. Where if you go out to the country and you look into the Greek country, is very rocky, it's very hilly, there's a lot of mountains in there, and you go up into these high mountain villages, and you expect these very religious idiots, these morons, to be starving to death. Yet, when you go out there, you don't see this. You see that they're actually thriving and surviving. And it's because these people know how to go out and find their food. They know where the food comes from. It's not coming from a department store. So if the department store food gets cut off, you don't have that department store there anymore, and there's no fresh food coming in, there's no problem because your food comes right out from in front of your door. You know where your food comes from. But the thing is that and this has sort of been somewhat of a revival on the left, where you're seeing now a move away from socialism on the left, and particularly with the Democrats. If you go look at the environmental movement is a new form of socialism. Socialism is traditionally atheist. It's without God. It's primarily intellectual within the mind. But the new environmental movement is not that at all. The new environmental movement is a new type of socialist, a neo-socialist, who is agnostic in their belief in God. They're not sure whether God believes or not, and has taken on a tribal identity. And this is why they strongly relate to the natives and any of these so-called earth religions. This is where they gravitate towards, and some of them who are more further out will gravitate towards cults like the Raelians and alien abductions and alien experiences and so on and so forth. This is something that you can see in the so-called the neo-tribalist or the neo-socialist movement that sort of forms the environmental movement. The environmental movement is strongly in this section here. This is where you can find the medical marijuana, the hemp party, a lot of these so-called the neo hippie movements. They're all like this, and they're actually a form or an evolution of a form of nihilism. And so you might have to go. We will get into nihilism, or not, we'll get into nihilism and some of these existentialist philosophy as it applies to the new dynamics in the political situation. But there is an enormous amount to discuss here because there is an enormous amount of context that has to be really sort of parsed out. And the thing is, as much as philosophical understanding and philosophical content needs to be parsed out, it always sits, all intellectualism, all philosophical understanding sits within the reality of the person's individual experience. So you can see, and we will look into how real world events, how real world living affects some of the intellectual movements, how it perceives things. And we can show why that the intellectual left is continually failing. Why it doesn't see the damage that it causes as it continues on in its quest for existence. And this, in some ways, can also be said on the Christian right. There are these people who do have their own sense of idealism that they wish to promote, and as I said, Bill O'Reilly is a good example that we're going to take a look at. We're going to compare Anderson Cooper and Aaron Burnett on the CNN side of things, and then we're going to go over and look at some of the things that Bill O'Reilly says. And one of the things I was looking at, this is where he comes up with a contradiction here. In the Bill O'Reilly factor today, they were talking about a case against a man that the Department of Justice had just dropped because supposedly a California man had uttered some death threats against President Barack Obama, which is a violation of federal law. And according to the O'Reilly factor and Bill O'Reilly, a liberal Ninth Circuit court overturned the conviction based on the fact that this person was exercising his free speech. So they used a First Amendment argument to overturn the conviction. Bill O'Reilly's comments were that he was more or less incensed by this, and that the justices should be upholding the law rather than doing what they're doing. That this was sort of we call judicial activism. But the problem is, though, if you're a constitutionalist, as many Republicans would like to believe they are, and say they're supposed to be constitutionalists, this is where you can agree with the liberal, what they call the supposedly liberal Ninth Circuit Court, and say yes. Yet we don't agree with what this person says about killing Barack Obama, but you can say it because this is what the First Amendment says. I mean, here is the First Amendment as it actually is written. And this, what I've done is I've taken a snippet out of it. I'm not going to do the whole First Amendment because the whole First Amendment includes religion and a whole bunch of other things. So I'm just going to look specifically at the issue of free speech. And here's how it reads. Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or of the press. And the question is, does this law, that says you can't say something that, they're going to kill the president or something threatening about the president, is this unconstitutional? Does it violate speech? Is this a law restricting, abridging the freedom of speech? And yes, it is. And the same thing, this is also true with DCA. This is also true of SOPA. This is also true of Protect IP. This is also true of the new SOPA that's supposedly coming out now. I just took a look around and saw that there's a new SOPA coming out. And this new SOPA looks like it's going to be Where did I put it here now? Oh, can't find it yet. But oh, here it is. Yeah, it's known as CISPA, or the Cyber Intelligence Sharing and Protection Act, and its bill ID is HR 3523. And it's extending this whole thing about watching what a person says on Twitter. This is the same issue that when you had someone from two people from England, two teens from England, being arrested and sent back to England for what they said on Twitter. And we could see now that there is a continued erosion of the Bill of Rights, the Constitution in the United States. And both sides, the Republican side and the Democratic left side, are guilty of this. It's not one side or the other. I mean, all you have to do, because Fox is supposedly known as this Republican media center, and all you have to do is take a look and see. Remember what the First Amendment says. It says Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or of the press. And here what do we see under Fox's copyright disclaimer? We see it says here. Where is it here? Right. This material may not be published, broadcast, rewritten, or redistributed. Copyright 2012 Fox News Network LLC. Well, there it is right there. There is the constitutional violation. There is the violation of the First Amendment right there within the DCA. And here we see this whole news network that stands up there and says, we are for constitutional president. We want a constitutional government strictly by these constitutional rules. And here they are violating the First Amendment. And this is true. And so anyone who works for Fox, including Bill O'Reilly, all these people, anyone who talks about their love of the Constitution, this includes Glenn Beck, who still uses his own thing. I've got to go find his stuff, but I saw the copyright on there as well. Anyone who does this and says that they believe in the Constitution unabridged, and yet are now working and have restricted their access to their work using the DCA, well, they're violating the First Amendment. So you can call them on this. But this is also true of the left. When the left says, they believe in free speech and they would need to go out and, you can say whatever you want to say, then all of a sudden, if you say the wrong word, or because you're not part of the proper visible minority, that you can now be shut up, taken off the air, or you can be arrested for a hate crime or hate speech because you're not part of this visible minority. I mean, I'm not part of this. I'm not part of the majority. I'm not white, but I'm not part of the visible minority. I'm part of an invisible minority. Anyways, we will talk more about this and other goings-on as we move into the second half and into foreign affairs in the second half. All right, I'll see you within 2 minutes.